The silence in room 307 was the kind that made even seasoned nurses avoid lingering too long. It wasn't just quiet. It was hollow, expectant, like the moment before thunder breaks. For 18 days, the machines had been breathing for Isabella Hartwell, their rhythmic hiss and beep. The only proof that the 26-year-old heiress to the Hartwell pharmaceutical fortune was still somewhere inside the motionless shell, lying beneath crisp white sheets. 18 days since the car accident that had sent her Mercedes spinning off the coastal highway. 18 days since her father, Richard Hartwell, had paced these halls offering million-dollar rewards to any doctor who could bring his daughter back to consciousness. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The neurologists had tried everything. They had adjusted medications, manipulated her positioning, brought in specialists from Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic who spoke in hushed tones about brainstem function and Glasgow Coma Scale scores. They had performed test after test, each one revealing the same stubborn truth. Isabella's brain showed activity, showed life, but something was keeping her locked away from the world. Her father had demanded second opinions, third opinions, had flown in doctors from Switzerland and Germany, each one more expensive than the last. But tonight, at 2:47 in the morning, the only person in that room was a man in a faded blue janitor's uniform, moving quietly between the monitors with a mop bucket that had seen better days. His name was Marcus Rodriguez, and he was 34 years old, though the weight he carried in his shoulders made him look older. He worked the graveyard shift at Metropolitan Medical Center because it paid $1.50 more per hour than day shift, and because it meant he could be home when his 8-year-old daughter Sophia got ready for school. Marcus had been cleaning this room for 2 weeks now, ever since they had transferred Isabella from the ICU to the long-term care wing. He had watched the parade of doctors and specialists, had seen her father's desperate hope slowly transform into something harder and more brittle. He had emptied trash cans full of tissues and medical journals, had mopped floors where grown men had broken down and wept, and through it all, he had found himself drawn to the woman in the bed, to the way her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink, to the peaceful expression that made her look like she was simply dreaming. Most of the staff had stopped talking to Isabella weeks ago. The doctors spoke about her, not to her, discussing treatment plans and prognoses as if she were already gone. But Marcus had noticed things that others missed, the way her fingers sometimes twitched when certain nurses entered the room, the slight change in her breathing when her father read to her from the financial reports he brought each evening. Small signs that meant nothing to the medical equipment, but everything to someone who understood what it felt like to be overlooked. Marcus knew about being invisible. He had learned that being a janitor meant people looked through you, spoke around you, forgot you were there, even when you were standing 3 feet away. It was a kind of superpower, really, this ability to move through spaces without being seen. He heard things in his 8-hour shifts that would have shocked the families who trusted this place with their loved ones. He heard doctors admit they didn't know what they were doing. He heard nurses complain about patients they thought couldn't hear them. He heard the truth that lived in the spaces between visiting hours. But he also heard other things. He heard the way Richard Hartwell's voice broke when he thought no one was listening, the way he whispered apologies to his daughter for all the times work had kept him away. He heard the old security guard, Frank, telling stories about watching Isabella grow up in these same hallways when she used to visit her mother during cancer treatments 20 years ago. He heard the night shift nurse, Carmen, humming lullabies in Spanish when she thought Isabella might be restless. Tonight felt different, though Marcus couldn't put his finger on why. The autumn rain was drumming against the windows with unusual force, and the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker more than usual. Richard Hartwell had left earlier than normal. His face drawn and pale, his expensive suit wrinkled in a way that suggested he had been sleeping in hospital chairs again. The last specialist, a woman from Boston with credentials that filled an entire wall, had delivered her verdict that afternoon. They should consider withdrawing life support. There was nothing more they could do. Marcus pushed his mop across the linoleum floor, the familiar motion soothing in its repetition. He had been doing this work for 6 years now, ever since Sophia's mother had died and left him with a mortgage he couldn't afford on a construction worker's salary. The accident that had crushed 3 vertebrae in his back had ended his career in building. But it had also led him here, to this quiet world of antiseptic corridors and hushed conversations. He paused near Isabella's bed, studying her face in the dim light. The bruising from the accident had faded weeks ago, leaving her looking almost ethereal, untouched by the chaos that had brought her here. Her father had brought in personal items to make the room feel more like home photographs of family vacations, a small collection of her favorite books, and an old radio that he sometimes tuned to classical stations, convinced that familiar music might somehow reach her. The radio sat silent on the windowsill now, its digital display dark. Marcus had heard Richard mention once that Isabella loved music, that she had played piano since she was 5, that some of his happiest memories were of hearing her practice pieces by Chopin and Debussy when she came home from boarding school. He had also mentioned, in one of those vulnerable moments when grief made people say things they normally kept private, that they used to dance together in the living room when she was little, spinning to old songs that reminded him of his own father. Marcus set his mop aside and approached the radio. He wasn't supposed to touch the family's personal items, but something was pulling him forward. Some instinct he couldn't name. His fingers found the power button and the display flickered to life. The station was already tuned to 98.7, the classical station that Richard preferred. But when the music began to play, it wasn't Chopin or Mozart filling the room. It was something older, warmer. A voice that belonged to another era, smooth and rich like aged whiskey, singing about autumn leaves and lost love. Frank Sinatra's "The Way You Look Tonight" drifted through the small speakers, and Marcus felt something shift in the air around him. It was the kind of song that grandparents had danced to, the kind that played at weddings and anniversary parties, the kind that carried the weight of entire lifetimes in its melody. Marcus glanced at Isabella, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. But something made him look closer. Was that a flicker behind her closed eyelids? A subtle change in the rhythm of her breathing? He moved closer to the bed, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. The monitors continued their steady beeping, unchanged. But Marcus could swear there was something different about her face, some loosening of the peaceful mask she had worn for weeks. And then, so softly, he almost missed it. He heard her whisper, "Daddy?" Marcus froze, his hand still extended toward the radio. The word had been barely audible, more breath than voice, but it cut through the quiet room like a bell. He stared at Isabella's face, watching for any sign that he hadn't imagined it. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the continued wheeze of the ventilator and the steady pulse of the heart monitor. Then, her eyes opened. Not the gradual, confused awakening that the doctors had described as a best-case scenario, but a clear, immediate awareness that seemed to focus directly on the radio. Her lips moved again, forming words that Marcus had to lean closer to hear. She whispered, her voice hoarse from weeks of silence. "Daddy used to! We used to dance!" Marcus felt his legs go weak. He grabbed the edge of the bed to steady himself, his mind racing through everything he had been told about coma patients, about the impossibility of what he was witnessing. Isabella's eyes found his face, and for a moment she looked confused, trying to place this stranger in the janitor's uniform who was staring at her with an expression of complete shock. "Where?" she started, then stopped, her gaze moving around the room, taking in the medical equipment, the hospital bed, the IV lines running into her arm. "What happened to me?" Marcus opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out. He had cleaned hundreds of hospital rooms, had worked around patients in every stage of recovery and decline, but he had never been the first person someone spoke to after waking from a coma. He didn't know the protocol, didn't know what he was supposed to do or say. All he knew was that something impossible had just happened. And he was the only witness. I should call someone," he managed finally, his voice barely steady. "Your father? The doctors? They need to know you're awake." Isabella tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at the various tubes and wires connected to her body. "My father," she said, and there was something in her voice that Marcus couldn't quite identify. "How long have I been here? He must be. Is he okay?" Before Marcus could answer, Isabella's gaze returned to the radio, where Sinatra's voice continued to fill the room with gentle nostalgia. "That song," she said again, and this time Marcus could hear the emotion building in her voice. "He used to play it all the time when I was little. After my mother died, it was the only thing that could make him smile. We would dance in the kitchen, and he would tell me I looked just like her when she was young." Marcus watched her face transform as the memories surfaced, watched years of pain and longing play across features that were suddenly, vividly alive. And in that moment, he understood that he had witnessed something far more profound than a medical miracle. He had seen a daughter return to a father who had been waiting in the darkness for 18 days, hoping for exactly this moment. The radio continued to play, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway. Night. Shift nurses making their rounds, doctors checking on patients, the normal rhythm of a hospital that never truly slept. Soon, this room would be full of people, full of medical equipment and urgent voices, and questions that would need answering. Isabella's awakening would become a case study, a medical curiosity, a story that would be retold in conferences and journals. But right now, in this moment, it was just a young woman listening to her father's favorite song, and a janitor who had somehow become the bridge between her lost world and the one waiting for her return. Marcus reached for the call button, knowing that everything was about to change. As his finger pressed the small red light that would summon the medical team, he looked back at Isabella one more time. She was still focused on the radio, tears streaming down her cheeks, her lips moving silently to words that seemed to carry the weight of an entire childhood. "Thank you. Bye," she whispered, and Marcus realized she was speaking to him. "I think I was waiting for it." The call light blinked on the panel at the nurse's station, and Marcus could hear the rapid footsteps of someone responding. In a few seconds, this quiet room would explode into controlled chaos. But for now, Frank Sinatra continued to sing about the way someone looked tonight, and Isabella Hartwell continued to cry tears of recognition and relief. And Marcus Rodriguez stood quietly in the corner, holding a mop, and trying to process the fact that he had just changed someone's life simply by turning on a radio. The door burst open, and Dr. Patricia Morales rushed in, her stethoscope swinging as she moved. She was the attending physician for the long-term care unit. A woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and the kind of calm competence that came from decades of dealing with the impossible. She took one look at Isabella, who was now sitting partially upright and wiping tears from her face, and stopped dead, in her tracks. "Oh my God," Dr. Morales breathed, and for a moment she looked as stunned as Marcus felt. "Isabella? Can you hear me? Can you tell me your name? Isabella Hartwell, came the clear response, and Marcus could see Dr. Morales's professional composure struggling to reassert itself. I was in an accident. A car accident. How long have I been here? Doctor. Morales moved to the bedside, her hands already reaching for Isabella's wrist to check her pulse. Her eyes scanning the monitors that continued to show normal vital signs. 18 days, she said gently. You've been in a coma for 18 days. Isabella, this is extraordinary. What's the last thing you remember? As Isabella began to respond, describing fragments of memory from the night of her accident, Dr. Morales's gaze fell on Marcus, who was still standing near the radio with his mop in hand. Marcus, she said quietly, what happened here? When did she wake up? Marcus glanced at Isabella, who was now looking at him with curiosity and something that might have been gratitude. I was cleaning, he said simply. I turned on the radio, and the song started playing. She just opened her eyes. Dr. Morales frowned, looking from Marcus to the radio to Isabella. What song? The Way You Look Tonight, Isabella answered, her voice growing stronger with each word. Frank Sinatra. It was my father's favorite. We used to dance to it when I was little. She paused, her expression shifting to concern. Where is my father? Is he here? He left about an hour ago. Dr. Morales said, already reaching for her phone. But I'll call him right away. Isabella, I need to ask you some questions. Run some tests. What you're experiencing, waking up this suddenly, and this completely, it's not typical. We need to make sure. I'm fine, Isabella interrupted, and there was something in her voice that reminded Marcus of her father, the same quiet authority that suggested she was used to being listened to. I feel fine, tired, and confused, but fine. The song. It was like someone calling my name. From very far away, I followed it back. Doctor, Morales nodded, though Marcus could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, already composing the medical reports that would try to explain what had just happened. I'm going to page your father, she said, moving toward the door. And I need to call Dr. Brennan and probably half a dozen other specialists. Marcus, can you stay with her for a few minutes? Just until we get the family here? Marcus nodded, setting his mop bucket aside. As Dr. Morales disappeared into the hallway, her voice already rapid and urgent as she made phone calls, the room seemed to settle back into its previous quiet. The radio continued to play, though Sinatra had given way to something softer, more modern. Isabella was looking around the room with the careful attention of someone trying to piece together lost time. You're the janitor, she said, and it wasn't a question. I remember seeing you before, I think. In dreams, maybe. You were always so quiet. Yes, ma'am, Marcus said, then caught himself. And, oh, Pen, I mean, yes. I've been cleaning your room for about 2 weeks now. Isabella studied his face with the kind of direct gaze that made Marcus understand why she was her father's heir. A parent. There was intelligence there, and perception, and something else that might have been kindness. You didn't have to turn on the radio. You didn't have to turn on the radio, she said. That wasn't part of your job, was it? Marcus shook his head. No, ma'am. Your father mentioned once that you loved music, and tonight felt different somehow. I can't really explain it. Isabella smiled then, the first real smile Marcus had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. You saved my life, she said simply. Not the doctors, not the machines. You! A song my father used to play when I couldn't sleep, when I was scared, when the world felt too big and too lonely. You brought me home." Before Marcus could respond, the door opened again. And this time, it was Richard Hartwell who rushed through. His normally perfect hair disheveled, his tie askew, his face a mixture of hope and terror that Marcus recognized from every parent who had ever waited for news about their child. He saw Isabella sitting up in bed, saw her turn toward him with clear, aware eyes, and the sound that came from his throat was something between a sob and a prayer. "Isabella," he whispered. And then he was beside the bed, his hands reaching for her face as if he needed to touch her to believe she was real. "Oh, sweetheart," I thought. We all thought. "I'm here, Daddy," Isabella said, and Marcus saw her reach up to touch her father's cheek. "I'm right here." And as father and daughter embraced for the first time in 18 days, Marcus quietly picked up his mop and began to back toward the door. This was a moment that belonged to them, not to him. He was just the janitor, who happened to turn on a radio at exactly the right moment, who happened to choose the exact song that could call a lost daughter home to her father. But as he reached the threshold, Isabella's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, looking at him over her father's shoulder. "What's your name?" "Marcus," he said. "Marcus Rodriguez." "Marcus," she repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything." Richard Hartwell looked up then, his eyes red with tears, but focused with an intensity that made Marcus suddenly aware that he was looking at one of the most powerful men in the pharmaceutical industry. "You?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus said quietly, "I was just cleaning, and I turned on the radio, and the song came on, and she just opened her eyes." Richard stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus could see him processing this information, trying to understand how a janitor had accomplished what teams of desk specialists had failed to do. "What song?" he asked finally. "The Way You Look Tonight," Isabella answered before Marcus could speak. "Frank Sinatra. Remember, Daddy? You used to say it reminded you of Mom." Richard's expression shifted, and suddenly he looked younger, more vulnerable, like a man remembering who he had been before grief. And responsibility had hardened him into someone else. "Your mother's favorite," he said softly. "She used to hum it while she was cooking dinner. You would dance on my feet in the kitchen. And you would tell me I looked just like her," Isabella finished. "I remember. Even in the dark place where I was, I remembered." Marcus watched this reunion unfold, watched two people find their way back to each other through the bridge of an old song, and felt something shift inside his own chest. He thought about Sophia, about how she always asked him to sing to her at bedtime, even though his voice was rough and untrained. He thought about the power of music, to reach places that medicine couldn't touch, to carry love across distances that seemed impossible to cross. The hallway behind him was beginning to fill with voices, nurses and doctors responding to the miracle that was spreading through the hospital like wildfire. Soon, this room would be crowded with medical professionals documenting Isabella's recovery, running tests, searching for scientific explanations for what had happened. Marcus knew he needed to get back to his work, to return to his world of mop buckets and quietly observed conversations. But as he turned to leave, Richard Hartwell's voice stopped him again. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, and there was something in his tone that made Marcus turn back. "We need to talk. Tomorrow, when things are less chaotic. There are things I need to know, things I need to understand. Would you be willing to meet with me?" Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure what Richard Hartwell could possibly want to discuss with a janitor. "Yes, sir. I work the night shift. But I could come in during the day if you need me to." "I'll find you," Richard said, And there was a promise in those words that Marcus didn't quite understand. "Thank you, Marcus, for bringing my daughter back to me." Marcus left them then, father and daughter reunited in a room filled with medical equipment and the lingering echo of Frank Sinatra's voice. He picked up his mop bucket and continued his rounds, moving through the quiet corridors of the hospital as he did every night. But something had changed. The invisible man who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans had somehow become visible, had somehow mattered, in a way that would change everything. As he worked, Marcus thought about the moment when Isabella's eyes had opened, about the way her face had transformed when she heard her father's favorite song. He thought about the power of small actions, of simple kindnesses, of being in the right place, at the right time, with the right intention. He had turned on a radio, not because he was a medical expert, but because he was a father who understood the language of love, who recognized the sound of someone calling across an impossible distance. And somewhere in the hospital, in a room that was no longer silent, a young woman was learning to live again while her father sat beside her, holding her hand and whispering the words to a song that had carried them both through the darkest 18 days of their lives. Marcus finished his shift as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the hospital corridors in shades of gold and pink. As he clocked out and headed home to wake Sophia for school, he had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. All he knew was that he had witnessed something beautiful, something that restored his faith in the possibility of miracles hiding in the most ordinary moments. The radio in room 307 continued to play softly, and Isabella Hartwell continued to remember who she was. One song at a time. The next evening, Marcus arrived at work to find everything changed. Word of Isabella Hartwell's miraculous awakening had spread through the hospital like electricity through water, and suddenly everyone seemed to know his name. Nurses who had never spoken to him before nodded as he passed. Doctors who normally looked through him made eye contact. Even the security guards at the front desk had given him a respectful nod when he clocked in. It made him deeply uncomfortable. Marcus had chosen his profession precisely because it allowed him to remain invisible, to move through the world without drawing attention or questions. He had built a life around the safety of anonymity, around being the person who cleaned up after other people's stories rather than becoming the story himself. But now, walking through the hallways with his mop bucket, he could feel eyes following him. He could hear whispered conversations that stopped when he got too close. "That's him," he heard a young nurse say to her colleague as he passed the nurse's station. "The janitor, who woke up the Hartwell girl." "I heard he used some kind of special technique," came the reply. "Like music therapy or something." Marcus kept walking, his face burning with embarrassment. There had been no technique, no special knowledge. He had simply turned on a radio because he felt sorry for a girl whose father missed her enough to bring in her favorite books. But he understood that people needed explanations for miracles, needed to believe there was method behind magic. Room 307 was different now, too. The door was cracked open instead of sealed shut, and he could hear voices inside. Isabella's clear soprano mixing with her father's deeper baritone in conversation. Marcus hesitated outside, unsure whether he should enter to clean or wait until they were finished talking. The decision was made for him when Richard Hartwell appeared in the doorway. "Marcus," he said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there the night before. A warmth that seemed to come from some deep place of gratitude. "I was hoping I'd see you. Could you spare a few minutes to talk?" Marcus set down his mop bucket and followed Richard into the room, where Isabella was sitting up in bed, looking remarkably alert for someone who had been unconscious for 18 days. She smiled when she saw him, the same genuine expression that had transformed her face the night before. Dad's been telling me about all the specialists who tried to wake me up, she said, and there was something almost mischievous in her tone. Apparently, they missed something important. They did their best, Marcus said quietly, uncomfortable with the implied criticism of the medical staff. Sometimes things just happen that can't be explained. Richard pulled a chair closer to the bed and gestured for Marcus to take the remaining seat. That's what I want to talk to you about, he said. This thing that can't be explained. Dr. Morales told me you've been working here for 6 years. You've seen other patients in similar conditions. Has anything like this ever happened before? Marcus shook his head. No, sir, nothing like this. But you chose that specific song, Isabella interjected. Out of everything that could have been playing on that radio, you chose the one song that could bring me back. That's not coincidence. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. I didn't choose it, ma'am. It was already tuned to that station. Your father must have left it there. I just turned it on. Richard frowned, looking puzzled. I haven't listened to that station in years. Not since. He trailed off, and Marcus could see him trying to remember. Actually, I have no idea what station that radio was tuned to. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room, as all three of them processed this information. Marcus replayed the moment in his mind. The dark display, the power button, the immediate sound of Sinatra's voice when the radio came to life. He was certain it had been tuned to 98.7. But now that he thought about it, he couldn't remember ever seeing Richard use the radio at all. Maybe one of the nurses, Marcus suggested, though he knew that wasn't true. The night shift staff rarely entered patient rooms unless specifically called. And Isabella's room had been one of the quiet ones, the kind where family members came and went without needing much assistance. Marcus, Richard said gently, and something in his tone made Marcus look up to meet his eyes. Tell me about yourself. About your daughter. Isabella mentioned you're a single father. The question caught Marcus off guard. In 6 years of working at the hospital, no one had ever asked him about his personal life. He was the quiet guy who cleaned the floors, who showed up on time and never caused problems. His story wasn't something that usually interested the kind of people who could afford private rooms and specialist consultations. Her name is Sophia, Marcus said slowly. She's 8. Her mother died when she was 2. Cancer. I was working construction then, but I had an accident, hurt my back. Couldn't do the physical work anymore. This job, it has good health insurance, and the hours work with Sophia's school schedule. Isabella leaned forward slightly. Her expression, intent. That must be difficult. Raising a child alone while working nights? When do you sleep? The question was asked with genuine curiosity, without the pity or judgment Marcus usually heard when people learned about his situation. I sleep when she's at school. Mostly. A few hours here and there. We make it work. What happened to your back? Richard asked. And Marcus was surprised by the clinical interest in his voice, as if he were genuinely concerned about the answer. Fell through a roof I was repairing. Compressed 3 vertebrae. The doctors said I was lucky I could still walk, but lifting anything heavy. Marcus shrugged. Construction wasn't an option anymore. Richard nodded slowly, and Marcus could see him processing this information, filing it away for some purpose Marcus couldn't fathom. Do you ever regret it? Leaving construction for this? The question was more complex than it seemed on the surface, and Marcus took a moment to consider his answer. Sometimes, he said honestly, I made good money in construction. There's something to be said for a job where you help people, even if they don't always notice. They notice more than you think, Isabella said softly. I noticed. Even when I was unconscious, I noticed. You were never rough with the cleaning, never turned the lights on too bright, Never made noise that might disturb someone who was trying to rest. That kind of consideration. It's rare. Marcus felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. He had never thought of his work in those terms. Had creation. Had great Marcus Frontes never considered that unconscious patients might still be aware of their environment. I just tried to be respectful, he said. Exactly, Richard said, and there was something building in his voice. Some kind of recognition or understanding. Marcus, can I ask you something that might seem strange? When you turned on that radio, when you heard the song start playing, what did you think? Marcus closed his eyes, trying to recreate the moment in his memory. I thought about what you'd said about dancing with her when she was little. About how music was something you shared. And I thought. He paused, unsure whether to continue. Go on, Isabella encouraged. I thought about how I sing to Sophia when she can't sleep. Silly songs, lullabies. My mother used to sing to me, and how sometimes that's the only thing that works when she's scared or sad. Music reaches places that words can't touch. Richard was staring at him with an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable. You're a father, he said. And it wasn't quite a question. You understand what it means to love someone more than your own life? To feel helpless when you can't fix their pain. Yes, sir. Then you understand why I need to do something to thank you. Something more than words. Marcus shifted in his chair, suddenly wary. Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate the thought, but I don't need anything. I was just doing what felt right. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Marcus, Isabella said gently, my father isn't the kind of man who lets good deeds go unrewarded. And frankly, neither am I. You saved my life. That comes with consequences. The word consequences made Marcus's stomach clench. He had heard stories about wealthy families, about how their gratitude could be as overwhelming as their anger. He didn't want money he hadn't earned. Didn't want charity that would make him feel smaller than he already felt in their presence. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with the same focused attention he probably brought to board meetings and corporate negotiations. What if it wasn't charity? He asked. What if I told you I've been watching you for the past 2 weeks, watching how you work, how you interact with staff and patients? What if I said I was impressed by what I saw, even before last night happened? Marcus blinked, confused. I don't understand. I've been here every day for 18 days, Richard continued. 18 days of watching doctors and nurses and specialists come and go, watching how they treated my daughter, how they treated me, how they treated each other, and in all that time, you were the only person who consistently treated Isabella like she was still a person, not just a medical case. That's not true, Marcus protested. The nurses, the doctors, they all care about their patients. They care about their jobs, Isabella corrected, though not unkindly. There's a difference. You cared about me, a man you'd never met, who couldn't thank you or acknowledge your kindness. You treated me with dignity, because that's who you are, not because it was required or because someone was watching. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder that looked like it contained official documents. Marcus, I want to offer you a position, not as charity, but because I think you have qualities that are rare and valuable, qualities that my company needs. Marcus stared at the folder as if it might bite him. Mr. Hartwell, I don't have a college education. I don't know anything about the pharmaceutical business. I'm not qualified for whatever you're thinking. You're qualified for exactly what I'm thinking. Richard said firmly. Marcus. Hartwell Pharmaceuticals employs 12,000 people worldwide. We have research facilities, manufacturing plants, offices in 37 countries, and in all of that infrastructure, do you know what we're missing? Marcus shook his head. Heart, Isabella answered for her father. We're missing heart, Richard nodded. We have brilliant scientists, effective managers, skilled marketers. What we don't have are people who understand that behind every medication we manufacture, behind every treatment we develop, there are real people with real families who are scared and hoping for someone to care. I still don't understand what you want me to do, Marcus said. Richard opened the folder and pulled out what looked like a job description. Patient Advocacy Liaison. You would work directly with our clinical trial departments, our patient assistance programs, our community outreach initiatives. Your job would be to make sure we never lose sight of the human element in what we do. Marcus took the paper with trembling hands, scanning the text that described responsibilities he could barely comprehend. Mr. Hartwell, this position, the salary listed here, there's no way I'm qualified for this. The salary is non-negotiable, Richard said firmly. And as for qualifications, you've just demonstrated the most important one. You saw someone who needed help, someone everyone else had given up on, and you found a way to reach them. You did it without training, without authority, without any expectation of reward. That's not a skill you can teach in business school. Isabella leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that might have been excitement. Marcus, do you know how rare it is to find someone who acts with genuine compassion? Someone who doesn't want recognition or reward? Who just does the right thing because it's right? Most people are decent, Marcus said, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Most people are distracted, Richard corrected. They're thinking about promotions, about paychecks, about how their actions will affect their reputation. You weren't thinking about any of that. When you turned on that radio, you were thinking about a father who missed his daughter and a daughter who might be lost in the dark. Marcus read through the job description again, trying to process the numbers and responsibilities that seemed to belong to someone else's life. The salary alone was more than 3 times what he made as a janitor. With that kind of money, he could move Sophia to a better neighborhood, could afford the tutoring she needed for the learning disability they'd discovered last year, could maybe even start saving for her college education. But something about it felt wrong, felt too easy. People like him didn't get opportunities like this. There had to be a catch, some expectation he wasn't understanding. Why me? He asked finally. Why not promote someone who already works for your company? Someone who understands the business? Richard exchanged a look with Isabella, and Marcus could see some kind of silent communication pass between them. Because, Richard said slowly, I think you might be the kind of person who could help me remember who I used to be. The statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcus looked at Richard Hartwell, billionaire pharmaceutical executive, one of the most powerful men in the industry, and tried to see past the expensive suit and the corporate confidence to whatever vulnerability lay beneath. I used to care more, Richard continued, his voice quieter now. When I was younger, when I first started the company, I cared about individual patients, individual stories, but somewhere along the way, as the business grew, as the stakes got higher, I lost that focus. Everything became about numbers, about market share, about beating the competition. Dad, Isabella said gently, you still care. You've donated millions to medical research, to patient assistance programs. Donated money, Richard said. That's not the same thing as caring. That's just writing checks. Marcus didn't write me a check last night. He saw someone who needed help, and he helped them. When was the last time I did something like that? Marcus felt like he was witnessing something private, some kind of reckoning between father and daughter that he had no right to observe. But Isabella seemed to want him there, seemed to think his presence was important to whatever was happening. The night Mom died, Isabella said softly, and Marcus saw Richard's composure crack just slightly. You sat with Mrs. Chen in the waiting room for 4 hours because her husband was having surgery, and she didn't speak English well enough to understand what the doctors were telling her. You held her hand and helped her call her family. Richard closed his eyes, and Marcus could see him remembering. Your mother made me promise to stay human, he said, to never let success make me forget what really mattered. After she died, after I had to raise you alone while running the company, everything became about efficiency, about results. I told myself I was being practical, that sentiment was a luxury I couldn't afford. But you never stopped loving me, Isabella said. You never stopped showing up, even when work was demanding, even when I was difficult. That's different, Richard said. You're my daughter. That's biology, that's automatic. No, Marcus said quietly, and both father and daughter turned to look at him. It's not automatic. Love is a choice you make every day. Caring is something you decide to do, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something. I see parents every day who choose differently. Richard stared at him, and Marcus could see some kind of recognition dawning in his eyes. In your work here, you see families under stress. Marcus nodded. I see families who drive across 3 states to be with someone they love, and I see families who don't visit at all. I see parents who sleep in waiting room chairs for weeks, and parents who make excuses about why they can't take time off work. The love isn't automatic, Mr. Hartwell. You chose to be here every day for 18 days. You chose to bring in specialists, to bring in her favorite books, to never give up hope. That wasn't biology. That was character. Isabella reached out and took her father's hand, and Marcus could see tears in her eyes. Marcus is right, Dad. You never stopped being the man Mom fell in love with. You just convinced yourself that caring was a weakness instead of a strength. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at their joined hands. When he looked up, his expression was different somehow. Softer, more open. Marcus, I want you to think about my offer. Not just the position, but what it represents. I'm not asking you to fix my company or solve my problems. I'm asking you to help me remember how to see people instead of just patients, individuals instead of just demographics. And what if I can't do that? Marcus asked. What if I'm not the person you think I am? Then we'll figure it out together, Isabella said. But I don't think that's going to be a problem. You woke me up with a song my father used to sing. If that's not seeing people as individuals, I don't know what is. Marcus looked down at the job description again, at the salary and benefits that could change everything for him and Sophia. But more than that, he thought about the opportunity to help other people the way he had helped Isabella, to be part of something that mattered beyond his own small world. Can I ask you something? He said. Anything, Richard replied. If I take this job, if I try to do what you're asking, will you listen to me, even when I tell you things you don't want to hear? Even when I suggest changes that might be expensive or difficult? Richard smiled, and for the first time, Marcus could see the man Isabella remembered from her childhood. Someone warmer, more approachable than the corporate executive who had first walked into this hospital 18 days ago. Especially then, Richard said. That's exactly why I need you. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether he was about to fall or fly. I need to think about it, he said finally. I need to talk to Sophia. Make sure she understands what this would mean for our lives. Of course, Richard said, standing and extending his hand. Take all the time you need. But Marcus, I hope you'll say yes. I think we could do some good together. As Marcus shook Richard's hand, he felt the strange sensation of his entire world shifting around him. 24 hours ago, he had been invisible, unnoticed, content to live in the margins of other people's stories. Now, somehow, he had become the center of something he didn't fully understand. Something that might be the beginning of a new kind of family, a new kind of purpose. He finished his shift that morning, with the job offer folded carefully in his pocket, thinking about the conversation he would need to have with Sophia, about the leap of faith that Richard Hartwell was asking him to make. But mostly, he thought about Isabella's words, that sometimes music reaches places that medicine cannot touch, that caring is a choice we make every day, and that small acts of kindness can change the entire trajectory of a life. As he drove home through the early morning traffic, Marcus allowed himself to imagine a different future. One where his daughter could have opportunities he had never dreamed of, where his work could matter in ways he had never thought possible, where a man in a janitor's uniform could become something more, without ever forgetting where he came from. The radio in his car was playing softly, and when Frank Sinatra's voice drifted through the speakers singing "The Way You Look Tonight," Marcus didn't change the station. Instead, he smiled and thought about the miracle of second chances, about the way love can call us back from the deepest darkness, and about the extraordinary power of ordinary people who choose to care when caring matters most. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of the Hartwell Pharmaceuticals building, wearing a suit that still felt foreign on his shoulders and trying to understand why 12 executives were staring at him like he had suggested they burn the building down. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," said Victoria Chen, the vice president of clinical development, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You want us to delay the Phase 3 trials for HC47 because you think our patient recruitment process is—" "What was the word you used? Dehumanizing?" Marcus shifted in his chair, acutely aware that his tie was slightly crooked, and that everyone else in the room seemed to communicate in a language of acronyms and corporate terminology he was still learning. "I said it was impersonal," he corrected gently. "The recruitment materials read like legal documents. Patients can't understand what they're signing up for, what the risks really are, what kind of support they'll have during the trial." "The IRB has approved all our materials," interjected Dr. Raymond Kessler, head of regulatory affairs. "Everything is fully compliant with FDA guidelines. We can't just change recruitment protocols because they don't sound friendly enough." Richard Hartwell sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he watched the debate unfold around Marcus. In the 3 weeks since Marcus had accepted the position, Richard had insisted he attend these high-level meetings, had given him access to clinical trial data and patient outcome reports, had asked him to review everything, from informed consent documents to patient assistance program applications. It had been overwhelming at first, the sheer scale of the company's operations, the complexity of drug development, the layers of regulation and approval that governed every decision. But gradually, Marcus had begun to see patterns, to identify places where the human element had been lost in the pursuit of efficiency and compliance. "Marcus," said Jennifer Walsh, the head of marketing, her tone carefully diplomatic, "I appreciate your perspective. I really do. But we're not running a support group here. We're conducting scientific research. The recruitment process has to prioritize data integrity and regulatory compliance over comfort. Marcus took a deep breath, thinking about the conversation he'd had with Sophia the night before. She had asked him about his new job, about why he looked tired and frustrated when he came home from these meetings. He had tried to explain that he was learning to speak up for people who couldn't speak for themselves, that sometimes doing the right thing meant making people uncomfortable. "Can I tell to you about Maria Santos?" Marcus asked, and the room fell silent. "She's 63 years old, has advanced pancreatic cancer, speaks limited English. Her daughter brought her to our clinic because she heard we might have a new treatment. She spent 4 hours in our waiting room, filled out forms she couldn't understand, met with coordinators who spoke too fast, and used medical terms she'd never heard." Victoria Chen glanced at her watch impatiently. "Marcus, we have protocols for translation services, for ensuring informed consent." "She left," Marcus continued quietly, "without enrolling, without getting the treatment that might have saved her life, because she was scared and confused and felt like no one cared enough to explain things in a way she could understand." The room was quiet now, and Marcus could see Richard leaning forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on Marcus's words. "Her daughter called me 2 days later," Marcus said, "asked if there was any way they could try again. If maybe someone could sit down with them and just talk, like human beings. So I did. I spent an hour with them, went through every page of the consent form, explained what the drug was supposed to do, what the side effects might be, what their options were if it didn't work." "That's not your job," Dr. Kessler said, though his tone was less sharp than before. "Patient education is the responsibility of the clinical coordinators." "Maria enrolled the next day," Marcus said. "She's been on the drug for 2 weeks now, and her tumor markers have dropped by 30%. She might live to see her granddaughter graduate from high school. But she almost didn't get that chance because we were too busy following protocols to remember that she's a person, not a data point." Jennifer Walsh was taking notes now, her pen moving quickly across her tablet. "How many other patients have you worked with directly?" she asked. 17, Marcus replied. "Patients who were teller, considering dropping out of trials, who couldn't navigate our assistance programs, who felt lost in the system. All of them are still enrolled now. All of them understand their treatment plans and feel supported." Victoria Chen exchanged a look with Dr. Kessler, and Marcus could see them processing this information, trying to reconcile his approach with their established procedures. "Marcus," she said finally, "what you're describing sounds like individual case management. We can't provide that level of personal attention to every patient in our trials. It's not scalable." "Why not?" The question came from Richard, and everyone turned to look at him. "Why can't we provide that level of attention?" "Cost," Victoria said immediately. "Time. Resources. We're already operating on tight margins with these trials." Richard was quiet for a moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. "How much does it cost to recruit a replacement patient when someone drops out of a trial?" Dr. Kessler pulled up data on his tablet. "On average, about $15,000, plus the lost time and data." "And how many patients drop out of our trials annually, across all our current studies?" "Approximately 230. Richard did the math quickly. "So we're losing roughly $3.5 million a year to patient attrition, not counting the delays to our research timeline." Marcus felt a small surge of hope as he watched the executives begin to understand where Richard was heading. "Marcus," Richard said, turning his attention back to him, "if we were to implement your approach more broadly, what would that look like?" Marcus had been thinking about this question for weeks, sketching out ideas during his lunch breaks and late-night conversations with Sophia. "Patient navigators," he said. People whose only job is to guide patients and families through our processes. Not just clinical coordinators who have 20 other responsibilities, but advocates whose entire focus is making sure people understand their options and feel supported. That would require additional staff, Jennifer pointed out, training, supervision, ongoing management. It would also require a different mindset, Marcus said. We'd have to stop thinking about patients as trial participants and start thinking about them as partners in the research process. Victoria Chen leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. It's an interesting idea, she said slowly, but implementation would be complex. We'd need to restructure our entire patient engagement model. Start small, Marcus suggested. Pilot program. Choose 3 trials. Implement the navigator model. Track outcomes. Compare retention rates. Patient satisfaction. Data quality. If it works, expand it. Richard smiled, and Marcus could see approval in his expression. I like it. Victoria, I want you to work with Marcus to design the pilot program, 6-month timeline, full metrics tracking. If the data supports his approach, we'll discuss company-wide implementation. As the meeting continued, with various departments outlining their roles in the new initiative, Marcus felt a familiar sensation of being out of his depth. But this time, instead of the paralyzing fear he'd felt in his first few weeks, there was excitement. He was beginning to understand that his value wasn't in knowing all the corporate terminology or understanding every regulatory nuance. His value was in remembering that behind every protocol and procedure, there were real people with real fears and hopes. After the meeting, Richard asked Marcus to stay behind. As the conference room emptied, leaving just the 2 of them surrounded by whiteboards covered in project timelines and budget projections, Richard's corporate mask seemed to slip away. How are you holding up? Richard asked. And Marcus could hear genuine concern in his voice. It's a lot, Marcus admitted. Some days I feel like I'm speaking a foreign language, like everyone else learned some secret code that nobody taught me. Richard laughed, a sound Marcus had rarely heard from him. I felt the same way when I first started this company. Imposter syndrome, they call it. The feeling that everyone is going to figure out you don't belong here. Did it ever go away? Not completely, Richard said honestly, but I learned that the feeling usually means you're pushing yourself to grow, to become something more than what you were. That's uncomfortable, but it's not necessarily bad. Marcus nodded, thinking about the changes in his own life over the past month. Sophia was thriving in her new school, the one with smaller class sizes and specialized support for her learning differences. They'd moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood, where she could walk to school and play in the courtyard with other children. But the biggest change was in Marcus himself. The way he carried himself. The confidence that came from knowing his voice mattered. Richard, Marcus said, using his first name for the first time in a business setting. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. When Isabella was in the coma, when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do, did you ever think about giving up? Richard was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Every day, he said finally. Every single day. The rational part of my brain knew they were right, that hope was becoming a kind of torture, but I couldn't let go, because letting go felt like abandoning her. That's how I feel about this job sometimes, Marcus said. Like if I give up, if I stop pushing for changes that make people uncomfortable, I'm abandoning all the patients who need someone to advocate for them. Richard turned to look at him, and Marcus could see something shifting in his expression. You know, when I first offered you this position, I thought I was doing you a favor, helping someone who had helped my family. But I'm beginning to realize you're the one doing me the favor." Before Marcus could ask what he meant, Richard's assistant appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Hartwell? Isabella is here for your lunch appointment." Marcus felt his stomach clench. He had seen Isabella several times since her recovery, but always in the hospital, always in the context of her ongoing medical care. This was different. She was here as Richard's daughter, as part of his family life that Marcus was somehow becoming entangled with. Isabella appeared in the doorway, looking radiant in a way that seemed impossible for someone who had been unconscious just a month ago. She was wearing a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and when she smiled at Marcus, he felt that familiar tightening in his chest that he was beginning to recognize as something more complicated than professional respect. "Marcus," she said, crossing the room, to hug him with an ease that suggested they were old friends rather than a janitor and the woman he'd helped save. "Dad told me about your presentation today. How did it go?" Marcus glanced at Richard, who was watching this exchange with an expression that was difficult to read. "It went well, I think. Your father approved a pilot program for patient navigation services." "That's wonderful," Isabella said, and Marcus could hear genuine excitement in her voice. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said that first night, about how music reaches places that medicine can't touch. I think that's true about compassion too. It reaches places that protocols and procedures can't." Richard gathered his papers, preparing to leave for lunch with his daughter. "Marcus, would you like to join us? I know Isabella has been wanting to hear more about your work." Marcus felt panic rising in his throat. Lunch with the Hartwells felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross, stepping into a world where he might be expected to be something other than what he was. "I appreciate the invitation," he said carefully, "but I should probably get back to work. I have patient calls to make this afternoon." Isabella's expression fell slightly, and Marcus immediately felt guilty for disappointing her. "Of course," she said, "but maybe another time? I'd love to hear about some of the patients you've been working with, if that's not too much of a privacy violation." "I'd like that," Marcus said, and realized he meant it. There was something about Isabella's interest that felt genuine, not like the polite curiosity of someone trying to make small talk. After they left, Marcus returned to his office. A real office with his name on the door and a window overlooking the city. It still felt surreal, this transformation from invisible janitor to corporate executive. But as he settled at his desk and pulled up the list of patients he needed to call that afternoon, he felt the familiar sense of purpose that had driven him to accept this position. His first call was to Maria Santos, checking on how she was adjusting to her treatment protocol. Her daughter answered, and Marcus could hear the relief in her voice when she recognized him. "Mr. Rodriguez, my mother has been asking about you. She wants to know if you'll be at her next appointment." Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.